I never imagined that silence could make so much noise. After my husband's burial, the house became too big for me. Each room seemed to echo memories that I didn't ask to revisit. The clock in the room marked the hours cruelly, as if to remind me that time kept passing, even when I felt that everything had stopped. I would sit in the armchair where he used to nap and stand there, staring at nothing. For the first time in 50 years, I was truly alone. I have always been seen as the woman of the house, not the woman of decisions. My husband solved the bank, the papers, the investments. I took care of meals, clothes, birthdays. I never questioned that. That was how it worked, and I trusted him more than myself. Now, at 72, I felt like a child abandoned in a world of hurried adults, full of difficult words and impatient looks. My daughter spent a few days with me after the burial. He said that work did not allow him to stay longer. Her husband, my son-in-law, always appeared solicitous, bringing groceries, paying bills, solving everything. He spoke with such confidence that I felt relieved. It was easier to deliver than to learn. Deep down, I just wanted someone to take control so I could keep breathing without overthinking. I signed some papers without reading them properly. He said it was to make it easier, to prevent me from having a headache. I believed it. After all, he was family. Who would suspect her own daughter's husband? I felt ashamed to ask simple questions, afraid of appearing ignorant. Then she smiled, thanked me and returned to my silence, thinking she was protected. The mornings began to repeat themselves. Cold coffee, curtains closed, television on without sound. I avoided leaving the house because the neighbors asked too much. "How are you?" they said, with pity in their eyes. I replied that I was fine, even though I didn't know what that meant now. At night, the fear came stronger. Fear of the future, of the bills, of depending on someone forever. At times, I felt that my daughter was talking to me as if I no longer understood anything. She explained too slowly, sighed when I asked something new. That hurt more than the grief. I wasn't sick, just sad. But it seemed that, to them, sadness and inability were the same thing. Even so, I tried to trust. I repeated to myself that I was in good hands. That my son-in-law took care of everything. That I just needed to rest. This phrase has become a comfortable, almost hypnotic mantra. Take care of everything. I didn't realize that by accepting this, I was giving up much more than I imagined. That week, I organized some old photos. Me and my husband are young, smiling, full of plans. In none of them did I look weak. On the contrary. I had been strong before, I had just forgotten about it. But the memory came faintly, like a whisper that was soon lost in the heavy air of the room. The night before the one that would change everything, I slept poorly. I dreamed that I was trying to speak, but no one listened to me. I woke up with a racing heart and a strange feeling in my chest, as if something was about to happen. I ignored it. I told myself it was just anxiety, an age thing. The next morning, as I washed a forgotten cup in the sink, the phone rang. The sound was dry, too loud for such a quiet house. I wiped my hands slowly before answering, not knowing that that call would break not only my routine, but everything I believed about my family and myself. I stared at the phone for a few seconds before answering, as if that object had taken on a life of its own. His heart was beating too fast for an ordinary morning. When I brought the device to my ear, a polite, firm, unfamiliar voice introduced itself as being from my husband's bench. He said my full name, confirmed my CPF and then made a request that made me cold. He needed me to appear in person at the branch as soon as possible. I asked, in a trembling voice, if there was a problem. On the other side, there was a short, calculated pause. He said that there were recent movements that needed to be clarified directly with me. That word kept echoing in my head. Movements. I barely left the house. How could there be something going on without me knowing? I thanked him, wrote down the address and hung up slowly, as if the simple gesture could avoid what was to come. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, feeling my legs weak. The coffee cooled in the cup, forgotten. A sense of danger began to spread through my body, something I hadn't felt in years. The first person I thought of was my son-in-law. I picked up the phone again and called him. I told him about the call, trying to sound calm. He laughed lightly, said it must be some standard procedure, an automatic thing of the bank. He told me not to worry, that he would take care of it later. Those words, which had previously comforted me, did not have the same effect this time. I hung up without arguing, but something inside me didn't calm down. For the first time, I felt like going alone. I didn't want anyone to speak for me. It was strange, almost frightening, to feel this impulse after so long of accepting help without question. Even so, the fear was still greater than the courage. I started to get ready slowly, as if each gesture was heavy. I chose a simple outfit, put on a light lipstick and tied my hair. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and almost didn't recognize myself. I looked older, more tired, but there was also something new in my eyes. A different attention, perhaps. As I closed the house, I thought about giving up. I could call my son-in-law again, ask him to solve it. It was the easiest way. But the memory of the pause in the attendant's voice stopped me. That was not normal. I felt it. And ignoring that feeling would be like betraying myself. On the way to the bank, I observed the city as if I were seeing everything for the first time. The people in a hurry, the cars, the shop windows. I was part of that world, even if they had convinced me otherwise. This realization gave me a little strength, although my stomach was still churned. As I entered the branch, the cold air and the smell of cleanliness gave me goosebumps. I gave my name at the reception and was invited to sit down. As I waited, my hands trembled in my lap. I repeated in my mind that everything had to have a simple explanation. I still had no idea how big the hole that was about to open. When the manager appeared and called me by name, I noticed something on his face that made me freeze completely. It was not haste, nor neglect. It was seriousness. In that moment, I knew that this conversation would not be quick or easy, and that, from then on, my life would begin to change in a way I would never have chosen. The manager led me to a small room with glass walls and a bright table in the center. He asked me to sit down and close the door carefully, as if that gesture was already part of something delicate. He opened a folder, took a deep breath and said that before anything else he needed to confirm, had I authorized someone to move my accounts in the last few months? I nodded my head, feeling a lump form in my throat. I explained that my son-in-law had been taking care of financial matters since my husband's death. He said this almost automatically, as if he were repeating something rehearsed. The manager looked up at that moment, too attentive. He asked if I had given a formal power of attorney. I said yes, although I didn't remember exactly when or how. That embarrassed me deeply. He then turned the computer screen in my direction. He pointed out dates, amounts, destination accounts. High transfers, made in sequence. Attempts to sell a property, my house. My heart raced. That didn't make sense. I never asked for any of that. The letters began to shuffle before my eyes. I said there must be some mistake. That maybe my son-in-law was organizing something for the future. The manager kept his cool, but his voice became firmer. He explained that those movements indicated risk and that, by protocol, they needed to talk to me directly. He said I was there because the account was mine. For the first time, someone reinforced it out loud. I asked for a glass of water. My hands were shaking too much. While drinking, I thought about my daughter. I picked up the phone and called her from there. I quickly told him what was happening. On the other side, I heard an impatient sigh. She said that I was getting confused, that her husband knew what he was doing, that I shouldn't make trouble now. Her words cut me more than any number on that screen. There was no concern, no curiosity. Just hurry to close the matter. She repeated the phrase that everyone seemed to like to use, "Mom, my husband takes care of this." As if that ended any doubt. As if I had no right to ask. I hung up with teary eyes. The manager noticed. He said, carefully, that it was common for elderly people to be pressured to give up control without realizing it. That word, elderly, bothered me, but the truth behind it hit me hard. Was that how they saw me? How easy someone to drive? He explained to me that there was also a recent request to expand the powers of the power of attorney, including medical and legal decisions. That made me freeze. It wasn't just money. It was my life. My autonomy. Everything was being organized away from me, as if I was no longer capable of existing on my own. I left the room stunned. The street seemed noisier, more aggressive. Inside the car, I cried like I hadn't cried since the burial. It wasn't just sadness. It was the bitter feeling of having been deceived by those who claimed to protect me. For the first time, the word betrayal crossed my mind. When I got home, I sat on the couch without turning on the television. The house was the same, but I wasn't. Something had broken inside me. I still didn't understand everything, but I knew one thing with frightening clarity. Trusting blindly had put me in danger, and if I did nothing, no one would do it for me. I spent the night almost without sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw numbers, dates and that word that kept in my head, blindfold. My house. The place where I raised my daughter, where I grew old next to my husband. I got up still dark and walked around the room, touching the furniture, as if I needed to prove to myself that everything was still there. The next morning, I returned to the bank alone. I didn't warn anyone. Part of me felt guilty about it, as if I was doing something wrong by investigating my own life. When I arrived, the manager greeted me with the same serious look. That didn't scare me so much anymore. Fear began to mix with something new, a desire to understand. He opened the statements again and, this time, explained everything more calmly. It showed monthly transfers, always below a value that would draw immediate attention. Small, constant, silent withdrawals. I shook my head, trying to keep up. I have never felt so much hatred of difficult words as at that moment. I asked where the money went. He pointed out an account at another bank, in the name of a company I had never heard of. He said that the company was linked to my son-in-law. My stomach turned. That was not organization, nor care. It was a plan. A plan made with patience and coolness. When I saw the date of the first transfer, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It had started even before my husband's death. While I was taking care of him sick, someone was already taking care of taking pieces of our life. This realization made me tremble. It was not something recent. I had been observed, studied, used. The manager also talked about an attempt to borrow in my name, which was narrowly denied. If it had been approved, I would have been in debt without even knowing it. I thought about how everyone said I was being protected. Protected from what? Of the truth? From myself? I felt ashamed for having signed papers without reading them, but the shame soon turned to indignation. I had trusted because I was taught to trust. Because I was made to believe that asking was a sign of weakness. Now I saw the price of that with painful clarity. I asked the manager if I could still reverse that. He said yes, but that I needed to act fast. His every word sounded like a warning. It was no longer just about money. It was about preventing them from deciding for me, from erasing me little by little. As I stepped out of the bank, I took a deep breath in the parking lot. The sun was beating hard, and I felt my face warm, my eyes burning. I was scared, but it was no longer a paralyzing fear. It was a fear that pushed. That said, do something, now. I got in the car with a silent decision formed inside me. I didn't know how or with whom, but I was sure of one thing: I wouldn't pretend I didn't see it anymore. The movements I didn't recognize had opened my eyes, and I wouldn't close them again. In the days that followed, I started to observe everything with different eyes. Every call from my son-in-law, every short message from my daughter, everything seemed to carry a hidden weight. Before, these little things would go unnoticed. Now, each word was accompanied by a silent question: why? I felt tired, but strangely awake, as if I had woken up from a sleep that was too long. I went back to going through the drawers of my husband's office, something I had avoided since he left. The smell of old paper and waxed wood brought back fond memories, but also a deep pain. Among folders and envelopes, I found copies of old bank documents. Dates, signatures, values. I started to compare it with what I had seen on the bench. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. I realized that some financial decisions had changed in recent years, always after casual conversations with my son-in-law. He suggested, my husband agreed, and I just followed. At the time, it seemed normal. Now, I saw the pattern. It was not improvisation. It was a constant, patient, calculated influence. Suspicion hurt more than any certainty. Because to suspect meant to accept that someone close to him had been capable of something so low. I tried to convince myself that I was exaggerating, that grief was confusing me. But deep down, I knew that voice inside me didn't come from fear, it came from lucidity. When my son-in-law showed up that afternoon, bringing fruit and talking too loudly, I felt a tightness in my chest. I observed his gestures, the way he sat at ease in my house, as if it were already his. He spoke of investments, opportunities, the future. I just nodded, but inside every word sounded like a thinly disguised rehearsal. I asked, carefully, about some transfers. His smile wavered for a second, too short for anyone who didn't want to see, too long for me to ignore. He responded quickly, using technical terms, trying to tire me out with long explanations. That haste to close the matter confirmed what I feared. After he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. His hands were sweating, his heart was pounding. I had no doubts, something was wrong. And it was not small. The betrayal had not been an impulse, nor a mistake. It had been built calmly, using my confidence as a foundation. I called the bank again and asked to speak to the manager. For the first time, I didn't apologize for bothering her. He said he needed help to understand everything. He made an appointment and suggested that I take all the documents I had at home. That simple attitude gave me a thread of security. That night, I cried with rage. Not sadness. Anger at having been treated as incapable, for having decided my fate without consulting me. The pain was mixed with something I hadn't felt in years, indignation. And indignation has a force of its own. Before going to sleep, I looked at my wrinkled hands and thought about everything they had ever done. They raised a daughter, supported a house, held a man until his last breath. They were not weak hands. And at that moment, I understood, the first suspicion had been the beginning of my defense. On the morning of the scheduled meeting, I spread all the papers on the living room table. Contracts, old statements, copies of documents that I barely remembered signing. Looking at it all, I felt a tightness in my chest. Each sheet represented a moment when I trusted without question, where I let someone else decide for me while I just agreed, too tired to argue. At the bank, the manager and a lawyer appointed by him were waiting for me. The presence of that unknown man made me nervous, but it also brought a certain relief. He spoke calmly, explained each term, made a point of looking me in the eye. Something simple, but that made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. When he started showing the documents, I felt the floor disappear. There were broad powers of attorney, signed by me, granting powers that I never imagined. Authorization to sell goods, move accounts, take out loans. Some signatures I recognized as mine. Others, I wasn't so sure. It made me nauseous. I asked when it had been done. The lawyer pointed out specific dates, always in difficult periods, when my husband was hospitalized, when I was emotionally shaken. I remembered times when my son-in-law showed up with urgent papers, saying that it was better to solve it soon. I trusted it. I didn't read it. I signed in the dark. The worst came next. There was a document requesting medical evaluation for possible future interdiction. It was not active yet, but it had already been prepared. That wasn't just greed. It was a plan to get me completely out of the way. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I felt shame, anger, and a deep fear of myself. How could I allow that? The lawyer, noticing my state, said something I would never forget. This did not happen because you were weak, but because they trusted your good faith too much. Those words did not erase the pain, but they eased the weight of guilt. He explained that there was still time to act. That most of those acts could be revoked immediately. But it took speed and firmness. Hearing that ignited something inside me. I didn't want to postpone anything anymore. Time, which had once seemed like my enemy, was now a resource I needed to use well. I signed new documents that day, this time reading every line, asking questions, taking a deep breath before each signing. The contrast was stark. I felt tired, but also strangely alive. Every decision I made consciously seemed to give me back a piece of me. As I got out of the bank, I sat in the car and cried again. But it wasn't the same crying as before. It was not despair. It was mourning for who I had been, and strength for who I was beginning to be. I knew that the confrontation would still come, and that it would not be easy. As I drove back home, one certainty formed with frightening clarity. They had acted in the dark because they believed I would remain blind, and that was not going to happen anymore. I could have signed in the dark before, but from then on, my every step would be in daylight. After everything I discovered at the bank, I realized that I could no longer postpone that conversation. I called my daughter with a heavy heart and asked her to come to my house that night. I didn't explain much on the phone, I just said I needed to talk to her in person. The silence on the other end of the line made me nervous. She agreed, but her voice sounded impatient, as if she was doing me a favor. I spent the rest of the day with a weight on my chest, walking around the house, rehearsing phrases that never seemed strong enough. When she arrived, there was no hug or question about how I was. He entered, sat at the table and left his cell phone next to him, vibrating from time to time. That hurt me more than I care to admit. I started counting from the bank call, speaking slowly, choosing the words carefully, as if any wrong phrase could make her get up and leave. I wanted her to listen to me, not as a confused mother, but as a lucid woman asking for help. As I spoke, I noticed her face closing. It was neither surprise nor concern. It was defense. When I mentioned the transfers and the attempt to sell the house, she sighed deeply and interrupted me. She said that I was letting myself be carried away by fear, that banks exaggerate, that I was always very anxious. That hit me hard. Not because she disagreed, but because she didn't try to understand for a second. I took the documents and spread them on the table. I showed dates, values, signatures. She looked fast, without attention, as if reading something irrelevant. He said that paper accepts everything, that I was mixing things up because of grief. He said that I needed to rest, that I shouldn't get involved with complicated matters. Each word of hers seemed to push my voice to a smaller place, as if I were invading a space that no longer belonged to me. I asked her directly if she knew about the expanded power of attorney, the attempt at future interdiction. At that moment, she hesitated. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. She said that her husband just wanted to make sure everything was organized, that it was for my good. Those words, "for your sake," echoed within me like a cruel sentence. My good decided without me, planned behind my back, as if I were already out of life itself. I felt the anger rise slowly, hot, firmly. He said that that house was mine, that that money was mine, that I was still alive, conscious and capable. My voice trembled, but it didn't fail. For the first time in a long time, I didn't ask for understanding or affection. I asked for respect. She looked at me strangely, as if she were in front of a version of me that she didn't know, or that she preferred not to know. It was then that she said something that broke the little that was left between us. He said that I was getting difficult, that before it was easier to deal with me. That sentence explained everything. They missed the woman who trusted without asking, who signed without reading, who accepted ready-made decisions. The betrayal had not only been financial. It had been emotional, built on the convenience of my silence. The conversation ended without an agreement. She stood up, angry, saying that I was creating problems where none existed. There was no hug, no promise of help. Just a door closing too hard to be anger, too strong to be indifference. I sat at the table, looking at the scattered papers, feeling a heavy emptiness in my chest. I cried alone that night. I cried for the daughter I thought I had raised, for the alliance I imagined existed between us. But in the midst of the tears, something remained firm inside me. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't crazy. And even if it cost me my relationship with my own daughter, I wouldn't go back. Lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I understood something painful and liberating at the same time. I had lost my daughter's approval, but I had regained something much more important: my voice, my lucidity, my dignity. And from that moment on, I knew that I wouldn't just fight my son-in-law, I would fight for myself, no matter the cost. The next day, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. It was not peace, but clarity. I prepared my coffee slowly and sat at the table with the papers organized in a folder. For the first time since my husband's death, I had a plan, albeit an incomplete one. I picked up the phone and called the bank, asking to speak to the manager again. My voice came out firm, different from the other times. He attended to me with immediate attention and made an appointment for that same afternoon. When I arrived, I was welcomed as someone important, not a problem. That gave me strength. He introduced me to a lawyer appointed by the bank itself, a man with a calm speech and an attentive look, who shook my hand with respect. Just that gesture made me breathe better. The three of us sat in a reserved room. The lawyer asked me to tell everything from the beginning, at my own pace. He didn't interrupt me, he didn't hurry, he didn't sigh. As I spoke, I realized how much I needed to be heard. Every detail I narrated seemed to lighten an old weight, as if I were giving myself back parts that had been torn away. He analyzed the documents carefully, marking important points, explaining each risk in simple words. He said clearly that this was not carelessness or misunderstanding. It was an abuse of trust. Financial crime. Hearing this was shocking, but also liberating. It wasn't my imagination. It was not an exaggeration. It had a name, it had gravity. The lawyer explained that my son-in-law's plan was more common than I imagined: isolate, disqualify, control. First the money, then the decisions, finally the autonomy. He said that if I hadn't answered that call from the bank, I could have lost everything in a few months. My home, my savings, my voice. I asked if there was anything I could still do. He smiled slightly and said yes, but that I would need to be firm. Revoke powers of attorney, block movements, gather evidence and prepare for a difficult confrontation. It would not be quick, nor painless. But it was possible. That word, possible, echoed within me like hope. I signed new documents that day, now conscious of every line. I asked for copies of everything. I wrote down guidelines. I agreed on next steps. I left the room differently from how I entered. Still scared, but no longer lost. I had an ally. Someone who saw what I saw and was willing to help me turn the tide. In the parking lot, I sat in the car and stayed a few minutes in silence. I thought about my daughter, my son-in-law, everything that was yet to come. I knew that when they realized that I was no longer alone, the reaction would not be good. But for the first time, I didn't feel small in the face of it. Driving back home, I realized something simple and powerful: asking for help didn't make me weak. On the contrary. The real weakness had been to accept everything quietly. Now, I was choosing to fight the right way, with strategy and support. When I entered the house, I placed the folder on the table and watched it for a few seconds. That wasn't just paper. It was my defense, my chance, my new beginning. The unexpected ally had emerged, and with it, the certainty that I would not face this battle alone. In the days that followed, my home was no longer just a place of mourning and began to look like an archive of my own life. I scattered documents on the living room table, piled folders on the sofa, left drawers open like exposed wounds. Each paper seemed to watch me, as if it knew that, finally, I was ready to see what had always been there. The past was not dead. It had just been conveniently hidden. I started with the oldest documents, those that my husband kept with excessive care. Contracts, statements, handwritten notes. I noticed patterns that I had never noticed before. Repeated dates, frequent meetings, always with the presence of my son-in-law. At the time, I saw it as zeal, as someone willing to help. Now, each repetition felt like a calculated step toward control. It was painful to realize that it had all started long before my husband's death. The first movements came when he was still healthy, in amounts too small to attract attention. Nothing abrupt, nothing scandalous. Just enough to create habit, dependence, normality. That was how the plan was sustained. No one suspects what seems routine. When my husband got sick, everything intensified. I was emotionally drained, torn between hospitals, medicines, and the constant fear of loss. It was at that moment that my son-in-law became indispensable. He'd solved everything, said that I didn't have to worry. I believed it. Not because she was naive, but because she was too tired to fight against one more thing. One particular document made me pause for long minutes. A contract between my husband and a company linked to my son-in-law, quietly signed years ago. The amount was not high, but it was continuous. That was the key to everything. A bond created early, legitimate enough to open doors, silent enough not to arouse suspicion. My stomach turned when I realized how well it had been thought out. I felt a deep pain when I imagined that my husband had also been manipulated. Not out of weakness, but out of confidence. The same trust that I inherited from him, almost as a legacy. That didn't detract from the betrayal, it made it all the more cruel. They didn't just fool us. They studied us. I took these findings to the lawyer, who confirmed my suspicions with an almost surgical calm. He said something that stuck with me: whoever does this rarely starts by stealing everything. It starts by testing limits. Every limit I let be crossed, every unread signature, every silence of mine had fed that invisible monster. It was at that moment that I understood the real dimension of what I faced. It was not just a recent coup attempt. It was a long story of emotional and financial exploitation, built on the certainty that I would never react. The feeling of having lived inside a lie for so many years made me lose my breath. I had to sit down, take a deep breath, accept the pain before moving on. But along with the pain, something different began to be born. A necessary coldness. If they had been patient, I would have needed to be too. If they acted strategically, I couldn't act only with emotion. The victim needed to give way to the woman who observes, calculates, and acts at the right time. As I closed the last briefcase that night, I felt something definitive take hold inside me. The truth buried years ago finally had a name, form, and proof. And she would no longer be hidden. Not for revenge, but for justice. Because that story had been written without me for too long, and now, I would take back the authorship, no matter the cost. It didn't take long for them to realize that I wasn't as obedient as I used to be. My son-in-law's calls began to multiply, always at odd times, always with that too sweet tone that now gave me goosebumps. He asked if I was okay, if I had slept properly, if I needed anything. He was not careful. It was surveillance. He wanted to know how much I knew, how much I had advanced. In one of these calls, he casually commented that the bank had reached out, asking meaningless questions. He laughed, as if it was all a silly mess caused by me. She said that I must have expressed myself badly, that sometimes I was nervous and that confused people. That laugh didn't leave my head. It was the sound of someone trying to slow me down to regain control. On the same day, my daughter showed up at home unannounced. She came in talking loudly, saying she was worried about me. I observed every detail, as if I was evaluating myself. He said I was different, more suspicious, more aggressive. Hearing that was scary. Not because it was true, but because I understood exactly what they were doing. They were building a narrative against me. She sat down in front of me and, with calculated care, suggested that maybe it would be good for me to go to a doctor. He said it was just to be sure, to avoid problems in the future. At that moment, I felt a chill rise down my spine. What was once just a hidden document was now being said out loud. They wanted to prove that I was not well. They wanted to interdict me. I took a deep breath so I wouldn't scream. He said he didn't need any evaluation, that he knew exactly what was happening. My daughter sighed impatiently and said that this reaction only confirmed their concern. It was a cruel game. If I kept quiet, I was incapable. If I reacted, it was unstable. Any path put me at a disadvantage. After she left, my legs weakened. I sat on the couch feeling my heart racing, as if I had just run away from an invisible danger. For the first time, I felt real fear. Not afraid of losing money, but of losing myself. To wake up one day and find that other people were legally allowed to decide everything for me. I immediately called the lawyer, my voice breaking. I told every detail of the conversation, every sentence, every attempt to disqualify me. He was firm and direct. That was intimidation and preparation for an interdiction process. She said I needed to stop dealing with them alone. Everything, absolutely everything, should be recorded. I followed his guidelines with discipline. I started to write down call times, save messages, record unexpected visits. I started recording conversations when the law allowed it. That tired me emotionally, but it also strengthened me. Each note was proof that I wasn't confused. She was conscious, attentive, and reacting. At night, the fear returned with force. I thought about how many women my age had already been silenced like this, treated as incapable for the convenience of others. I thought about how easy it would be to label me, to push myself away, to erase myself. But along with this fear grew something even stronger, a profound refusal to disappear. Lying in the dark, I made a silent promise to myself. They could try to silence me, discredit me, turn me into a problem. They couldn't. I had already crossed the point of no return. He knew about the betrayal, he knew the plan, and he had proof. And from that moment on, I wasn't just fighting for money or a house. I was fighting for my freedom, and I wouldn't give it to anyone. After that night, something in me changed places. Fear still existed, but it no longer commanded my decisions. I woke up early, took a shower calmly and dressed as if I was going out to something important, because it was. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. The feeling was strange, almost solemn, as if I was taking on a role that had always been mine, but that I had forgotten. I sat at the table with a new notebook and started to write everything down. Dates, times, names, exact phrases that had been said. Every detail mattered. As I was writing, I noticed something curious. My mind was clear. There was no confusion, no lapses, no doubts. That, in itself, already dismantled the fragile image they tried to create of me. I carefully reviewed the lawyer's guidelines. Revocation of powers of attorney, blocking of access, formal communication with the bank. Each step had to be executed at the right time. There was no point in acting on impulse. I needed to be methodical, almost cold. And, to my own surprise, I succeeded. I went to the bank again, this time accompanied. I walked through the corridors with my head held high, feeling curious looks, but I didn't care. I signed documents carefully, asked questions, asked for written confirmations. The manager treated me with visible respect. There, I was not a confused widow. I was the account holder. At home, I started to change small routines. I started to answer calls only at specific times. He no longer opened the door without warning. I kept the documents in a safe place. It may seem little, but each such gesture was a silent assertion of control. They no longer had easy access to me. My son-in-law quickly noticed the change. He sent short, impatient messages. He asked why I didn't answer, why I was making things difficult. I answered little, always politely, always without explanations. I learned that I should no longer justify myself. Those who explain themselves too much give power. At times, the guilt tried to return. I thought about the family, what they would say, the weight of breaking up definitively. But it was enough to remember the interdiction plan, the attempt to sell my house, for the guilt to dissolve. I wasn't the one who was breaking up. I was defending myself. I started to observe everything with emotional distance. Their every move seemed predictable now. The urgency, the false concern, the tone of authority. When you understand the game, it loses some of its strength. And I was understanding too quickly for those who said they were confused. There was an afternoon when I looked at myself in the mirror and almost smiled. I saw a woman who was more tired, yes, but also firmer. Someone who had stopped asking permission to exist. That image gave me courage. I didn't have to be young to be strong. I just needed to be awake. That day, I understood something fundamental. I was no longer just the victim of a betrayal. I had become a strategist of my own defense. Every step was now thought out, every decision had a purpose. They didn't know it yet, but the game had changed, and this time, I was in control. This part that comes now is the hardest to share, because this is where I almost lost everything, including my voice. Telling this means reliving choices, fears and silences that still weigh on you, but that cannot continue to be hidden. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture to preserve stories that can no longer be erased. The day of the meeting came faster than I would have liked. I woke up before the alarm clock, with my heart beating firmly, but without that panic that used to overwhelm me. I drank coffee looking out the window, watching the street wake up, and I thought about how that day would mark a before and after in my life. I didn't know exactly how it would all end, but I knew I wouldn't leave there the same way I entered. I arrived at the bank accompanied by the lawyer. We walked side by side through the lobby, and I felt the weight of that moment with every step. We were led to a room larger than the previous ones, with a long table and chairs lined up. That was not an informal conversation. It was a confrontation. I sat up with the most upright posture I could, taking a deep breath to keep my cool. A few minutes later, the door opened and my daughter entered with my son-in-law. He seemed overconfident, smiling in a restrained way, as if believing he still has control of the situation. My daughter avoided my gaze. That hurt, but it didn't take me apart. I already expected this. That silence said more than any words. The manager began the meeting by explaining that there were serious irregularities to be discussed. As he spoke, my son-in-law tried to interrupt a few times, using technical terms, trying to take over the conversation. The lawyer, with polite firmness, asked that all the lines be directed to me. At that moment, I felt a small silent victory. When they began to design the extracts and documents, the air in the room changed. Dates, amounts, destination accounts. Everything is clear, organized, impossible to deny. I watched my son-in-law's face slowly lose security. He still tried to smile, but his eyes no longer followed. My daughter began to flip through the papers with trembling hands. I was invited to speak. My voice came out firm, more than I expected. I calmly told what I had discovered, how I had felt, the fear of losing my home and my autonomy. I didn't raise my tone. I didn't cry. Every word was supported by facts. That serenity was my greatest weapon. My son-in-law tried to defend himself. He said that everything had been done to protect me, that I was exaggerating, that I had always been too sensitive. The lawyer then presented the evidence that dismantled each of his arguments. Powers of attorney, attempts at interdiction, movements prior to my husband's death. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. My daughter finally spoke. Her voice was low, confused. She said she didn't know everything, that she trusted her husband. I didn't interrupt her. I just listened. For the first time, I didn't feel like convincing her of anything. The truth was already there, exposed on the table, greater than any justification. The manager informed that the accounts were officially blocked for any movement that was not authorized by me. The lawyer spoke about the legal measures that would be taken from then on. My son-in-law remained silent, looking down. That man, who had decided for me for so long, now had no voice. At the end of the meeting, I got up slowly, feeling my body tired but my mind clear. I looked at my daughter for a brief moment and then headed towards the door, without asking permission, without apologizing. The decisive meeting was over. And as I walked through that aisle of the bank, I knew with absolute certainty, the truth had come out, and there was no hiding it anymore. After the meeting at the bank, the silence spread like a heavy fog. No call, no message, no request for an explanation. It was as if I had been erased from their lives all of a sudden. Before, this distance would have destroyed me. Now, I understood exactly what it was, the loss of control. When someone can no longer manipulate, they try to punish with silence. The following days were strange, almost suspended in time. I woke up early, took care of the house, made my meals, but everything seemed to happen in another layer of reality. I knew that behind the scenes, important things were moving. Documents being analyzed, decisions being made, versions being confronted. The betrayal, which had previously been hidden, was now exposed to the light. The lawyer called me with frequent updates. Every conversation confirmed that my son-in-law's plan was old, structured, and impossible to justify as good intentions. There was no mistake, no confusion. There was a calculation. Hearing that hurt, but it also strengthened me. I wasn't fighting interpretations, I was facing facts. My son-in-law tried to contact me only once. A short, carefully written message saying that everything had gotten out of hand, that he never meant to hurt me, that things had been misinterpreted. I read that message several times before deleting it. Not a word there spoke of me. It spoke only of his fear of being exposed. The mask had fallen, and I was no longer obliged to pretend to believe. A few days later, my daughter showed up alone. It didn't bring anger or accusations. It brought confusion. She sat on the couch and cried as I hadn't seen her cry since she was a child. She said that she felt cheated, that she never imagined that her husband was capable of that. I listened to everything in silence. For the first time, I didn't try to protect anyone. Neither her, nor the image of our family. She asked me why I hadn't noticed before. That question pierced me hard. I took a deep breath before answering. He said that trust is not stupidity, it is choice. And that those who betray take advantage of precisely that. She also said that I didn't fail as a mother by trusting, but that she failed me by not listening to me. She lowered her head. There was no discussion. Just a hard truth to swallow. In the neighborhood, the looks began to change. Comments emerged, some veiled, others direct. People who had previously seen me as a frail lady now watched me cautiously. I didn't explain myself. I didn't correct versions. I learned that dignity is also knowing when silence is choice, not submission. When I received the official notification confirming the legal measures against my son-in-law, I felt something that was neither joy nor revenge. It was relief. A deep, physical relief. As if I could finally breathe without fear that someone would decide my future while I slept. I spent an entire afternoon reviewing old family photos. Not with anger, nor with blind nostalgia. I looked lucidly. There was love there. There were real moments. But there was also a lie. Accepting both at the same time was painful and liberating. Life no longer needed to be edited to make sense. The fall of the mask was not only his. It was mine too. The woman who swallowed doubts to keep the peace, who accepted to be diminished to avoid conflicts, no longer existed. In her place, there was someone whole, conscious and firm. The truth had come out, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same as before. The process has made its way with the relentless slowness of the things that really matter. Hearings, deadlines, legal terms that I learned to recognize by sound before I even fully understood the meaning. I made a point of following everything. Not because I distrusted the lawyer, but because, after all, I needed to be present in every decision that involved my life. Being excluded would never be an option again. On the day the final decision came, I was alone at home. The postman left the envelope and left without knowing that he was carrying the closure of a painful chapter of my story. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where I had been diminished so many times, and opened the letter carefully. I read slowly, line by line, as if confirming my own sanity. It was there, in cold and technical language. I was right. Justice recognized the improper movements, the attempts at interdiction, the abuse of trust. My son-in-law would be held responsible. Everything I tried to explain, that I tried to shout when no one wanted to listen, was now officially recorded. Even so, I didn't cry. The victory did not bring euphoria. It brought a deep tiredness, one of those that don't get through with a night's sleep. I realized, at that moment, that justice does not return lost time. It does not return nights of fear, nor the feeling of being treated as incapable. It does not erase betrayal or automatically rebuild broken ties. Justice only stops injustice. And maybe that's the most she can do. My daughter called that night. The conversation was short, careful, full of pauses. She said that everything had been difficult for her too, that she needed time to understand what had happened. I listened without arguing. It was no longer my role to explain, convince, or welcome as before. I just said that her time needed to respect mine too. There was no apology. There was no reconciliation. Just a polite silence between two women who were no longer the same. Over the next few days, I began to notice subtle changes around me. At the bank, they spoke to me directly, asked for my authorization, explained everything clearly. In the neighborhood, the looks were different. Some curious, others respectful. For the first time, I wasn't just the mother of, or the mother-in-law of. I was me. It may seem little, but for me that meant everything. Even so, there were losses that no judicial decision could repair. The trust in my own family, the image I had of my old age, the idea that growing old meant being cared for, not exploited. These certainties were broken. And I had to accept that some cracks don't mend themselves, they just incorporate themselves into our history. There were nights when loneliness came back to weigh on her. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but that of lucidity. When you start to see clearly, certain illusions do not return. I learned to live with it. To make silence my space, not a punishment imposed by others. I started to take care of my financial life with almost ritual attention. I learned terms, asked questions, followed statements. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. What was almost taken from me started to be treated with the seriousness it always deserved, including by me. As I put the final documents away in a new folder, I felt something close inside me. It was not joy, nor complete relief. It was acceptance. I had crossed something too big to get out unscathed. But it had come out in one piece. And in that moment, I understood that this, remaining whole after the truth, was already a profound form of victory. Months have passed since the end of the process, and time has begun to gain a different rhythm within me. The mornings were no longer heavy, and the silence of the house no longer sounded like abandonment. I was still alone, it's true, but not empty. There was something new occupying that space, consciousness. The certainty that I existed whole, without needing anyone's validation. I started to reorganize my life little by little, without haste. I changed small routines, moved furniture, opened the windows earlier. Each simple change felt symbolic, as if I was telling the house, and myself, that a new phase had begun. That almost lost house was now, more than ever, my territory. I learned to deal with money without fear. I didn't become a specialist, but I became an owner. He understood enough to ask questions, demand explanations, decide calmly. Something that once seemed too far away was now part of my daily life. It wasn't about excessive control, it was about autonomy. And that gave me a tranquility that I had never known. My relationship with my daughter remained cautious. We spoke little, carefully, as if treading on unstable ground. There was no full reconciliation, nor definitive separation. Only a possible, honest coexistence within its limits. I learned to accept this without guilt. Some relationships don't go back to what they were, and insisting on it is also a way of losing yourself. In the neighborhood, I noticed something curious. People started to treat me differently. Not with pity, but with respect. Some came to talk, ask for advice, tell stories. For the first time, my age seemed to carry positive weight. I was no longer seen as fragile, but as someone who had gone through something big, and survived. There was a day when I found myself smiling alone in front of the mirror. It was not vanity, nor nostalgia. It was recognition. I saw a woman marked by time, yes, but also strengthened by it. Someone who had been underestimated, deceived, almost erased, and who, even so, remained standing. I understood that I did not go back to who I was before. And that wasn't a loss. The woman of before trusted too much because she needed to believe in others to feel safe. The woman now trusts herself. That changes everything. Life didn't get easier, but it got more honest. Sometimes, the pain still appeared. A comment, a memory, an absence. But she no longer dominated me. I learned to welcome her without allowing her to define my steps. The dignity I regained was greater than any wound. I didn't build a perfect happy ending. There was no feast, no complete reconciliation, no late miracles. What happened was something better, reconstruction. A simpler, more conscious, more mine life. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It was enough to know who I was. Today, when I look back, I don't just see betrayal and pain. I see the exact moment I woke up. When the bank called me for that conversation, I thought I was losing everything. In fact, I was starting to find myself. And this new Donna Helena, stronger, more lucid, more whole, no one will ever be able to take away from me. If something in this story touched you, it's worth sharing. It's not just about what happened to me, but about patterns of silence, abuse of trust, and people who are discredited when they most need to be heard. When sharing, think of someone who may be experiencing something similar. Sometimes this simple gesture is the bridge that helps another person see that they are not alone. I'll be here reading each comment carefully, because these answers also cross me. Tell me, what city or country you're in, and if any part of that story connected with something you've lived through, knowing that really matters to me.